Уже давно, сука, тут. По тебе видно по твоей бороде, ебаная.
Да мужики, ну Украине. Ложись, блядь. Пожалуйста, не убивай.
Ложись. Ложись.
Ложись, блядь, на пузо.
In the last week of February, Russian troops have begun a new phase of the offensive in the Donbas. By the end of February, the operation near Kursk was essentially complete. The Russian armed forces drove the Ukrainian armed forces from the western outskirts of the city. At the same time, Ukrainian units had to break out of an encirclement yet again. Now troops from Kursk are being redeployed north to the Pokrovsk-Toretsk line. The next target of the offensive will probably be the city of Konstantinovka, the southernmost settlement in the agglomeration of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. At the same time, the Russian armed forces have approached the main supply route of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kursk region, that is, the Sudza-Sumy road. In the coming weeks, they will try to encircle the Ukrainian group in Sudza or force it to withdraw to the Sumy region. Sergei Gurets, Ukrainian military expert and CEO of the media and consulting company Defense Express, believes that Russia is actively deploying unmanned units to disrupt logistics supporting Ukrainian forces in the Kursk direction. He discussed his views on Ukrainian TV. In quotations, currently both sides are engaged in active operations in the Kursk region. For over 6 months, Ukrainian troops have held a position on Russian territory, although its area has now shrunk by over 60%. The Russian enemy has reinforced its troops to push out the Ukrainian armed forces. A few days ago, Russian troops forced our units out of Velyka, a settlement near the highway supplying our troops from Sumy to Sudzha. Meanwhile, the Russians advanced into Novenkoye in the Sumy region. Mr. Gurets claims that the Russians were later expelled. However, I have seen no information to corroborate this. According to Mr. Gurets, the issue is that near Velyka and Novenkoye, Russia is aggressively using drones to cut off logistics supporting Ukrainian troops in the Kursk direction. Russian forces are frequently attacking the Sumy-Sudzha highway with fiber optic drones, posing a serious challenge that requires a response from Ukraine's military leadership. Our aviation is actively engaged in countermeasures, striking identified enemy drone launch sites, and electronic warfare systems are also in use. However, maintaining our bridgehead in Kursk, the 45-kilometer long and about 20 kilometers wide, is increasingly difficult.
Вот он, первый батальон 9-го полка выводит трофеи в огневков.
Western flank, 20 kilometers away, allows the Russian enemy to exert pressure on our units, making defense extremely challenging. The political importance of holding this bridgehead is undeniable, but military and strategic risks must be considered, he said. If logistics deteriorate further, we must reassess the necessity of maintaining our presence in the Kursk region. Sometimes political considerations outweigh military pragmatism, Mr. Gurets noted. He concluded that while Ukrainian forces are tying down 60,000 Russian troops in Kursk, preventing them from being deployed elsewhere, the cost of maintaining this position must be carefully weighed. Ukraine must avoid another Krinky, he says, where soldiers displayed exceptional bravery under extremely difficult conditions. If a better defensive configuration can be achieved while still holding back the Russian enemy troops, military considerations should take precedence over political expectations. So this is the frontline report for the past week and a half in Ukraine. The most concerning area for the Ukrainian armed forces is the Kursk salient, which is now turning into a Russian encirclement. However, Russia has lost some ground in Pokrovsk and Toretsk, and it will be seen what comes of this in the coming weeks. Now, as this war approaches a possible peace settlement, the interest and information in this war is beginning to decline. So to help keep the show running, consider a donation via Super Thanks or PayPal. And while you're at it, check out the membership community for exclusive long-form analysis, combat footage, and breaking news not shown in the mainstream media.
Черт ёбаный! О, диви, ёба!
So shout out to the newest channel members and stick around to the end for bonus footage and a membership trailer video in the end screen. and let's get into it. Ukrainian media reported that the Russians, with the help of alleged North Koreans, continue their attempt to regain Kursk territories. For several months, the Russian troops have been trying to cut off Sudzha from the border with Ukraine. While the logistics from the Sumy region is under heavy fire, the Russian forces are breaking through to the highway south of Sudzha from both sides. From the west, they managed to advance and completely seize the border village of Velyka, and they were able to cross the border and tried to occupy Novosilka. However, the Ukrainian armed forces claimed that they stopped the offensive and that they pushed the Russians back. The Russians also attacked Lebedevka, where at first the Ukrainians held them back, but as of today, the Russians were able to advance to the north and liberated the village of Loknia. The Russians also managed to push the Ukrainian forces out of Nikolskoye to the other side of the Loknia River. From the eastern flank, after a successful counterattack by Ukrainian soldiers, the Russian troops are now trying to retake Panasivka, but the Ukrainian defense forces so far are holding the line. In the north, after several months of fighting on Pokrovsk and Orlovka, the Russian forces managed to push Ukrainian defenders out of those settlements and to the other side of the river, but reportedly those villages are still in the grey zone. Now here's a report on the Kursk and Sumy regions from a Ukrainian colonel by the name of Andriy Demchenko.
37-я бригада, позывной.
He says Russian troops continue to storm the Ukrainian border in the Sumy region, but these attempts are not massive. The officer noted that the Russian enemy uses large forces and equipment. In quotations, now we see that the Russians are trying to enter our territory with assault groups to expand the zone of active hostilities already on the territory of Ukraine. This is in the direction of the settlement of Novosilka, but the units of both the State Security Service of Ukraine and other components of the defense forces inflict maximum damage so that the Russian enemy cannot gain a foothold there, accumulate their forces on the territory of Ukraine, he says. Our task is to prevent the advance deep into Ukraine and cut the logistics routes provided by the Ukrainian defense forces during the operation within the Kursk region. This is not a mass assault. Actually, when the Russian enemy tries to knock out the Ukrainian defense forces from the Kursk region, they first of all put pressure on the flanks on our units within the Kursk region. And in the future, they try to expand the zone of active hostilities, trying to enter the territory of Ukraine. But all components of the defense forces are working in that direction to prevent this. All available weapons are used, Demchenko added. The village of Novosilka in the Sumy region was marked as a grey zone on the map of the Deep State Monitoring Resource. The head of the CPD, Andrei Kovalenko, said that Russian infantry without equipment is carrying out assaults along the borderline with Sumy region. On February 28th, the General Staff announced that the armed forces of Ukraine had stopped the breakthrough of Russian troops near the village, the Sumy region. However, they admit that the Russians continue to attempt to storm.
Pode, né? Aí, ó, pra quem acha que é uma festa, cenas pouquinho forte, tá, gente? Isso aqui, ó.
Now, the situation near Pokrovsk has been mixed for the Russian forces. Within a week, the Ukrainian armed forces were able to recapture some of their lost positions in Uspenivka, which the Russian army had been storming for about 2 months. In addition, the Ukrainian paratroopers advanced near Kotlyne and regained some positions there, thus affecting the Russian offensive plan to the north, bypassing Pokrovsk. Over the past 3 weeks, this is the 6th area where the Ukrainian defense forces have counterattacked. However, the Russian troops plan to actively attack again in the near future to eventually regain their disruption of the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka road.
Sei lá, 3 meses, 4 meses.
Німеччина, турецький напрямок. Найбезпечніші поїздки тут нічні.
Now, just a few weeks ago, the Russians had announced the complete liberation of Toretsk, but now the Ukrainian armed forces have launched multiple counterattacks, which led not only to the transition of a western part of the town into a grey zone. Some Ukrainian sources go as far as to claim that there's also an encirclement of the Russian forces. The Ukrainian defense forces attacked from the south through the Zabalka neighborhood, where they managed to recapture a spoil tip and part of a private housing area and reached the high-rise buildings. To counter this offensive, another one began from the north, near the central mine, where Ukrainian troops liberated several neighborhoods. Those Russian units that were making their way to the western outskirts of the town may soon find themselves cut off from the main forces. There are about 800 meters to go before the Ukrainian armed forces units moving towards each other from the south and north can be joined, according to several Ukrainian sources. Fierce fighting is currently taking place here, and the situation is changing dynamically. The Russians have stopped attacking, they say, and are adapting to the new reality.
Ми працюємо там, куди багато засобів не можуть долетіти, але для нас це реальні цілі і
Now, on a more positive note for the Russians, after about a month of assaults, they were able to capture the Zaporizhia village in the Novopavlivka section of the front. Now the Russians are about just under 7 kilometers from the Pokrovsk region. The next strategic target of the Russians is the village of Preobrazhenka, which is now semi-encircled. The Russians, however, have not been able to advance in Avdiivka, which is a few kilometers to the north. Meanwhile, to the south, fierce fighting is taking place near Andriivka and Constantinople. After the Ukrainian Defense Forces withdrew from the encirclement to Constantinople, we can fully rename this direction from Kurakovy to Novopavlivka. Now the Russians' goal is to finally close the pocket between Pokrovsk and Velyka Novosilka so that they can focus on Pokrovsk. Until this happens, there will be no major offensive on Pokrovsk, so the defense in this area is extremely important for the Ukrainian armed forces. So far, the Russian forces have managed to raise the flag liberating Velyka, although the Ukrainian armed forces claim that they are still fighting in the northern part of the village. In Constantinople, it isn't much news, but in Andriivka, the situation was changing extremely dynamically over the past week as fighting was constant for almost every house. The Ukrainian Defense Forces had initially pushed the Russians off the road to Oleksivka, so the Russian troops began to bypass the village from the north to expand the front line. The Russian armed forces moved additional troops air from Pokrovsk to build on their success and press the situation. As of today, the latest reports are that the Russians have liberated the village, though Ukrainian sources claim they still have a presence there. Now, throughout February, after the capture of Velyka Novosilka, the front to the north of it was the most dynamic. It was here that the Russian troops liberated the most Ukrainian land. In recent days, they have managed to capture Novo Ucheretuvati and Brylatsky and continue to advance northwest through Krivlyny, trying to bypass Ukrainian defense lines. Over the past week, the Russians have advanced by more than 2 kilometers over a 14-kilometer stretch. In Dnipro, an area which is located on the other side of the Mory-Yali River, the Ukrainian Defense Forces managed to gain a foothold and slowed the Russian attack. Instead, the Russians are moving north along the river toward Kumar. Their main goal is to block the Kurakovy-Zaporizhia road to cut off logistics for the Ukrainian defenders and try to encircle them again. So far, the latest reports are that the Russians have liberated the village of Skudny, but the defense of the next village, Vesely, is already being prepared. The Russian forces have deployed additional troops on the right flank and are preparing to advance towards Odradny and Bogatyr. You can see that the Russian army is trying to find gaps in Ukrainian defenses and is advancing only where they can, and where they meet resistance, the line is stabilizing. So far for this year, there are no deep Russian breakthroughs as there were in November and December.
Может, да, может.
Штурмовое подразделение на мотоциклах готовится к
While there has been some stability on the front line between Kharkiv and Luhansk regions for several weeks now, bad news for Ukraine came from Bilohorivka, where the Ukrainian armed forces have held an unbreakable line of defense for 2 years. Although the Russian army advance here ranged from 500 meters to 1 kilometer, they managed to liberate the dominating heights, forcing the Ukrainian defense forces to move outside of the village. As a result, Bilohorivka, one of the last villages in Luhansk region that was under Ukrainian control, has been liberated by the Russian army.
Быстрее по маневрению продвигаешься к окопу. Стреляешь в этот момент.
Has President Putin ever regretted the decision to invade. And some might see it like he had no choice with NATO's expansion. But was that really the right decision? And did you think it was the right decision?
Look, there is always a choice. Putin had choices too. Perhaps there were alternatives available to him. The issue isn't solely about NATO's eastward expansion, but rather the threats that emerged in Ukraine. It's one of the significant reasons behind what transpired. Putin didn't consider the possibility of such a war occurring. If he had thought that would be the outcome, he wouldn't have engaged in negotiations. When he realized the high number of casualties,